Hi there. I wanted to share another insight that I've gleaned that was both sobering and very illuminating. And essentially, it trails off the last video that I did around quantum superposition. The idea that, it's a fundamental concept in quantum mechanics that a particle or a quantum system exists in multiple states at the same time until it's observed or measured, and then it collapses into that state. And the analogy that was coming to me was that we also exist in multiple dimensions, and the more fragments we have from our trauma, the more dimensions that we have lower dimensions, lower selves. And as we become aware of them, so when we get triggered, we're living in that particular dimension or realm where that becomes our reality. We have the same thoughts, um, emotions and sensations of, that part of us that's emerged when we get triggered. The conscious mind shuts down and that part of the subconscious rises, and now we're living in that world with those beliefs, and that's the reality. And when you have really severe trauma, you can even get stuck in those realms, and that can become a psychotic episode or a psychotic state that you can get stuck in if you're not able. So there's not something or someone, resources that'll allow you to come out of it. And so essentially, what I started discovering or realizing is that there aren't just lower selves. From our traumas, we can go into lower and lower selves. The deeper, the more significant the trauma, the deeper the trauma is, the more mental illness there is, the more into these lower realms we go, where there's a risk that we can get stuck there. And then there's also higher dimensions or higher selves that I was experiencing, like degrees of what I said, the degrees of my higher self that came in, and so then you start, as the more you clear and heal, you kind of collapse those timelines. And as you heal and that energy comes back to you and you have a larger, higher self, so you can now more easily traverse these higher dimensions. And then that's where you can start to experience deeper healing and the theta healing state, for example, and meet, higher selves and beings from other dimensions, et cetera, et cetera. So the thing that also came to me then was, since then, was the idea that you can see now across this spectrum, these lower selves to the higher selves, there's characteristics. So in the lower selves, when I have more trauma and more fragments, there's more rigidity in the system, like I talk about in Vipassana. The way that the sankharas or the traumas manifest is rigidity in the mental and physical structure. So there's more rigidity, and as you clear, there becomes more fluidity in the system. And this is where I started melting my knots, and I started becoming more fluid in the body, and I started being able to deeper stretches in yoga, and even getting to the point where I could, as I went deeper, healing more injury, illness, and disease. So just like basal activation that we see in anesthesia, when you drop, one of the things that happens under anesthesia is you dramatically drop the basal activation, so then you can do whatever you need to do on the body under anesthesia. And I was getting to the state where I was even experiencing that, where I couldn't feel any pain when I would push all the way into the bone. But then there was a risk that I was going to cause an injury when I come out of that deeper state. So I started learning to trust my higher self to take me through that state with more precision so that I wouldn't cause injury. Kind of like chemotherapy, it's like a hacksaw to get rid of the cancer. You're killing a bunch of good cells in the interest of getting the bad cells. Instead, what my higher self was able to do is guide me through a flow like movement to just remove the trauma, the sankhara, in a sequence, in a flow, an unwinding that we see like in MFR, myofascial release. And you can look at the fascia video if you want to see that. I'll include it in the link. But essentially, then that's what I started experiencing. So as you clear more of the trauma from the system, sankharas, you become more fluid. You go from rigidity to fluidity. You go from, and what the system is always trying to do is heal ourselves. So in the lower dimensions, it's continuously replaying the trauma. It's like a record player that as soon as it gets triggered by any of the five senses, it triggers that particular trauma, that part of you, that sankhara. You start replaying that old record. And so you have the same thoughts, feelings, sensations, etc. Of that. And what the system is trying to do is continuously heal itself. So it's replaying this record with the hopes that one day you'll see the reflection and either heal it or rewrite it so that you can hopefully then heal it, release it. And so essentially it's a deeply intelligent system trying to continue. So, you'll notice like you keep running into the same character that bothers and triggers you. It's like you have a bad manager. You leave your job, you leave your company, and then again that character shows up, and you start seeing these patterns of the same kinds of things keep reappearing. And that's what the system's trying to do. It's taking some trauma that's embedded in my subconscious, and it keeps replaying it through experiences, situations, people, etc., so that I might one day see it. So that's why it's so valuable to start looking at the patterns, our emotional behavioral reactions, and the patterns we start to see, because those give us shed light on what are those sankharas or traumas in the system that we can then look at and even heal. And so essentially then what can happen if you go to these lower realms, you can get stuck. There's stagnation. So you don't progress. It's like you're stuck at being that age. Let's say a trauma occurred when I was 6 or 10 or whatever. When I get triggered, I'm reliving that particular experience over and over in that particular dimension while I'm in that realm. When I'm triggered, I'm living it. It's like, and I'm stuck in that point in time. It's like I never healed it. So it's like when I go to that place, I keep just replaying that same experience. So there's stagnation. And then as you move to the higher realms, what I'm noticing is things are healing, and like experience is closing much more rapidly. And what they say is like something that Thomas Hebel mentioned in the program I took about a week ago, was that you're actualizing potential more rapidly. So this idea of manifestation, I think basically there are all these things that we are meant to learn, our dharma or whatever you want to call it. And we have to release our karma so that we can get more of our dharma, our purpose, our, our destined future, and the things that we're intended to learn or like realize. And it can take many lifetimes. Or as you heal the trauma and you close those timelines, you essentially then start to see a quickening. So you're able to actualize, like, because you start developing more resource, you have less things that are slowing you down or blocking you or triggering you. So you can be more present, and you can actually tap into more tools and acquire more tools and techniques, just what I've experienced in my journey. And then you can start to close those timelines more rapidly, and you start to actualize things. So I'm seeing more flow, more synchronicity, more ahas. The things that are happening are just quickening like crazy. I'm seeing all kinds of, like, we're now building things, we're doing prototypes and AI-based platforms, like all kinds of things starting to happen. People that I'm meeting, like all kinds of amazing, amazing experiences. So I'm seeing this quickening happening. So there are all these characteristics that you start to see across the spectrum. So what occurred to me, so then one of the things that I was led to was this organization that's working on mental health with people that have had more severe mental health, things like PTSD or schizophrenia or developmental trauma or bipolar and so on, and they're trying to prevent them from ending up in psychiatric institutes long term. And they are exploring all kinds of tools and techniques, using medications as a last resort as opposed to a first resort. And they even mention things like Vipassana, which is what I experienced incredible, profound healing and impact with, as one of the tools that, in the movie Crazywise, which is a great movie I'll include in the link, and about how indigenous cultures actually, people who hear voices and see visions, some of them become shamans. And it's something that's like, if you look at a lot of the shamans in those places, one of the common things they have is what we would characterize as a psychotic episode when they were young. But because the culture and the processes and the tools and techniques allow them to move through it and to realize the gifts and to heal any traumas that arise, and through that then tap into their gifts. And there's a number of things that I've then again been led to, like the it's called the I forget if telepathy talks or the telepathy, but anyways, this about these autistic individuals, all this research, these autistic individuals who can read minds. They have these gifts, but we've kind of like stigmatized autism, and like they don't seem as high functioning in some respects. We've kind of discounted their abilities. And similarly with people that have like addiction. So if you look at like Gabor Mate's work, in his book, Realm of the Hungry Hidden Realm of the Hungry Ghost, I think it was called. Really amazing book. And he basically talks about addiction. He treated patients with addiction. He was in Vancouver. And he talks about like the research, some of the research and the characteristics around it. In particular, what struck me was, so briefly, there's like 4 circuits that he talks about with respect to addiction that's in the research. So there's dopamine generation, serotonin generation, stress regulation, and impulse control. And essentially, depending on what happens in your childhood, and especially around the concept of attunement, so if there was a lack of emotional attunement, especially, it doesn't matter whether you're rich or you're poor. I mean, it maybe more often happens when you're poor, because your parents aren't around. They're maybe having to do a bunch of jobs, or they have all kinds of issues that might be moving through, so they can't emotionally attune to you. But even the wealthy and people with a lot of privilege, if their parents are too busy or they're just not present, they're distracted, maybe they're caught up in whatever, they can't provide the attunement. He found that these 4 circuits would be neurologically affected. So if you take the extreme case where someone who's had, let's say, physical or sexual abuse in childhood, and these circuits are dramatically affected neurological development. Then what he found was, like, when they run into stress, and all of us run into stress, because the stress regulation isn't developed, they're not able to regulate their own stress. Their nervous systems get activated, and they're not able to reduce their stress. And then what happens is the system wants to heal itself. So it's trying to find things to reduce the stress. And because what you and I might do is generate dopamine and serotonin, things that will generate that naturally within our systems. They don't have it because those circuits are damaged. So then they're seeking something on the outside in order to, like, to soothe themselves, to self-regulate. And so people would describe to him like heroin being like a soft, warm hug, which is something that you get. Serotonin and dopamine are things that you get when you get nurture, like rocking a baby. Like, that's how they start to develop those circuits and those, so if you do 20-second hugs, for example, they say you start to generate dopamine. Happiness, these are happiness drugs within our systems that we generate. And so essentially then it's like, so then what happens is they're self-medicating. They're seeking the dopamine, serotonin on the outside. And a lot of these different substances or things basically fill the, they fill the dopamine and serotonin receptors. So they're basically replacing the dopamine and serotonin that they don't generate internally because those circuits are damaged. And then because that impulse control circuit is also damaged, they can't control themselves. So the biochemistry is working against them. It's not just a willpower thing. It's actually the biochemistry. So they get deeper and deeper into their addiction. And so they're seeking to, like, soothe from the stress. And so they end up homeless and lose their jobs, end up, like, on the streets, or all kinds of stuff he was sharing in the research. And because in his book, he talked about it's all a spectrum. So workaholism, for example, is a socially acceptable addiction. I had that. And so I could recognize and relate to a lot of the characteristics that he talks about. So he claimed to have a shopping addiction. So he talks about, like, there can be work, shopping, food, like sex, drugs, alcohol, etc., all a spectrum. So people, and in Portugal, he talked about an example. In Portugal, they had a significant drug problem where they were, I think it was heroin, and they were filling up the prisons and people were dying of infections. So the government got a group of people together. They got psychiatrists, psychologists, and therapists together and said, tell us what we should do. How do we solve this problem? And what they came back with was, they ended up they said, this is not a criminal problem. This is not a, societal problem. This is a social emotional problem. And so essentially what they did was they opened these places, and they said, and they made announcements and said, we will not arrest you. At least come and get clean needles so that you don't die of an infection. And if and when you choose to get off, if you'd like to get off, no obligation, off the drug, we'll help you. Job counseling and support and, career services and so on and so forth. And so they almost completely eliminated the infection problem and dramatically reduced the drug problem. And so essentially that was something that he was, trying to bring in the United States and has been speaking a lot to, all over the world. But essentially then it's like we would discount and dismiss these people with addiction because there's a little bit of too much resonance. So we throw them in prison. We kind of, tuck it away, out of sight, out of mind. But we are all somewhere on that spectrum, most of us, depending on what our experience was from our childhood, especially around attunement. When I worked with the Enneagram Prison Project in the San Quentin prison, where they use the Enneagram, which there's another video I'll post around the Enneagram, powerful tool for helping to heal trauma and discover your emotional behavioral patterns. But essentially, and I shared in that video, I met these prisoners, these inmates who are there for the most heinous crimes. These are max security prisons. So, armed robbery, murder, rape, etc. And when I met another type like mine, I'm a type 3, I met another person she introduced me to who was there for murder. And when I was listening to him, he sounded just like me. The things he said, the things that he, the way he thought about things, like his behaviors, and I remember thinking, like, whoa, this guy's here for murder, and he sounds just like me. Like, I didn't like the association. And then as I listened to him further and he was sharing more about his background and his experience, I realized, and also speaking with the founder, was most of these people who end up in prison have had really scary, horrific childhoods with a lot of abuse and trauma. And so then when their fear gets triggered and they have autonomic responses from the subconscious that rises, they do violent things as like this really strong self-defense mechanism. And so they end up in prison because of these autonomic, really like significant, severe responses. And because of circumstance, I realized it was a huge realization, humbling, very humbling realization, that maybe the only reason this person is behind bars and I'm out here is circumstance. I had a pretty decent childhood. He had a really horrible one. And that's the only reason we're on two sides of the bars. Not because I have greater willpower, I'm more intelligent or anything like that. It was pure circumstance. So what I started realizing, the aha that I recently came to, like literally this morning, is that as I'm like healing, and for those of you that are following the journey, as I'm healing, I'm getting more and more whole. My higher self, I'm going into these higher dimensions. I'm more whole. I'm getting more deeper insights. I'm like downloading like AI-based platforms and like coaching platforms and, you know, ways to like help humanity and developing deep insights and building all these connections, like amazing synchronicity, incredible insights, and like things that are just automatically connecting as I'm moving down this path. So it's been this amazing journey, which is incredibly energizing. And then the other thing that it's been happening, and I knew this from before, and now I've seen it kind of in more kind of extremes, is, and Barbara Brennan, who's a NASA physicist that wrote a couple of really fascinating books. Hands of Light was one of them, and the second one was Light Emerging. And she became this great healer, and she wrote these books about her healership journey and the things that she discovered on the way to promote that, and started a school. Hundreds of thousands of people have gone through it. She actually died in 2022, but she wrote these amazing books. And one of the things she talked about that resonated for me was this concept of contractions and expansions, or contractions and expansions. So when you have an expansion experience like I've had in some of these like meditation retreats or psychedelic retreats, like great expansion, all this light comes into you. What she talks about is that you experience, right, like unity consciousness, nirvana, like ecstasy, bliss, or whatever, like you experience these expansive, kind of experiences where you're connecting with consciousness, your higher self, or whatever, or releasing like big amounts of trauma. When the light comes in, it kind of also unblocks, it kind of shakes up and unblocks some of the next set of blocks in your system, your trauma, your sankharas. So then what naturally, if you think about it, the universe is always contracting and expanding. It's breathing. So is your heart. It's expanding and contracting. We also have contraction expansions, small pulses, she said, and longer pulses. So for example, when I go through something really expansive and the light comes in, it shakes these up, then I experience a contraction and I feel those blocks because they're now been loosened up and they're more on the surface. And you don't like it. You resist it because it's unpleasant, uncomfortable. You're touching your trauma. So most people resist it. And then what happens is, if you don't allow the full contraction, you won't get as big a expansion next time. So it's like the amount of the contraction determines how much of the expansion. And this is something that I discovered like several years while I was even at Google. Was what I started discovering was, if I honor whatever arose, anger, sadness, or fear, when something triggered me, the amount that I was able to lean into it and move through it was directly proportional to the amount of growth and light on the other side of that triggering experience or trauma. And so it was similar. It was like the amount that I was willing to accept the contraction determined how much of the expansion I experienced. So she was mentioning this, and what I've started experiencing is, I have these, since last August, these incredible expansions. And then I have these contractions where I go, deep into my trauma, ancestral trauma. Even my last ayahuasca journey, I went deep into my ancestral trauma and experienced like oceans of tears and sadness that I was releasing from the system as I healed it. So this was the contraction. Because I'm able to honor it, I then experience even bigger. And what started happening is, my energy when I go into these expansions is so high, and I get these downloads, I call them insights, like I got like this one, where I'm filled with tons of energy. And what was interesting was, I was reading this book recently that I was led to through the Compassion Mental Health Organization, called Neurofeedback for Developmental Trauma, I think it's called, but it's Seaburn Fisher that wrote it. And essentially, they were talking about, as I mentioned in the last episode, they were talking about how developmental trauma is trauma that comes from childhood, and it comes from disconnection from mother. The amount of abandonment, attachment theory. So how much you you develop detachment because there's an abandonment, emotional, and physical. So depending how severe the detachment is from your mother or mother figure, determines the amount of trauma that you'll have and the loss of sense of self. And so these kids will experience, who've had severe abandonment issues and attachment issues, will have terror. They're living in terror and fear. And so they have all kinds of problems, from like sleep to behavioral to emotional, severe trauma, really hard to treat. And what they really need is someone that's so grounded that they can co-regulate with. Well, most people get triggered because when they get triggered, their traumas are so severe, their nervous systems are activated. It triggers mine. It's contagious because anything in my system that resonates with theirs will trigger. So then I get triggered, and this of course triggers them, and it gets escalating. So I can no longer help them unless I have the resources to ground, so that they can then co-regulate with me and ground and heal. Inevitably, people start feeling, therapists, rejected, dejected, frustrated, because they can't see progress. because this trauma is so significant and it's so hard to treat. And so inevitably they are unable to see sufficient progress because they get re-triggered and that re-triggers them, and then they get worse. The trauma gets worse. They're talking about this in the book. And what I could really relate to then was at my last uh, Thomas Hubel event that I did, the trauma-informed consulting and coaching program. When I went to one of his long-term students that's also a therapist, in the tea room they called it, where you can go to try it out, and everyone had been telling me how great it was. So I went, and one of the things that they shared with me was, I said, like, okay, so what do you want to work on? And I said, well, I always feel kind of excluded in groups. Like I somehow always feel like I don't fit in, whenever I go into any of these breakouts, or initially anyway, in any group settings. Like I always feel like that. Maybe we can look at that. And so when she looked at it, what she found was, she said, what I'm noticing or being drawn to is the speed at which you're speaking, And then she said, and I think she said, tell me about your childhood or something. I was telling her about my mom, and I mentioned how she had bipolar. And one of the things that she said then was, if you have someone with bipolar, a parent, or a figure in your life, a child will start to like move very rapidly, because the only way to get your needs met, because they're unpredictable. And so you develop that as a survival mechanism, as a trauma response, and it served you. I get a lot of stuff done. I'm like very action oriented, and I'm like really, I think fast, I move fast, and that's part of what what allowed me to rise in my career. So it was a socially acceptable, trauma response, kind of like workaholism, a socially acceptable addiction. But essentially, what she suggested then was, I was like, oh, so whenever I'm speaking fast, maybe that'll alert me to like slow down and tune into my heart or ground the energy. And then she said, no, I think we should do just the opposite. Let's tune into the speed. So then she's like, let's just go there. Like what comes to you when you tune in, and accept it. Don't try to reject it or fix it or get rid of it. Just like tune into it. And the moment I did that with her, I was taken to this image where I was it felt like I was at the edge of existence. I was in like deep space. It was like dark. I was screaming into the void, beyond what felt like the edge of existence. No one could hear me. I was a child. And the feeling was terror. Now, that's not a word I've ever used in my vernacular. It's not something that comes to mind for me. I'm generally very, there's moments of anxiety and so on, but never experienced, never said that word, even in my experience. And as soon as I tuned into that and felt it, I suddenly started crying, sobbing. And after like 2 or 3 seconds of that, my awareness immediately came into my heart. I could feel my heart beating in my chest. And I felt grounded, embodied. And I suddenly realized the power of tuning into my trauma. And then releasing it through the tears and becoming more grounded, being able to feel my heart and feel more grounded. And immediately the speed I slowed down. And this is the same experience I had when I was at the last ayahuasca journey with unity consciousness, and everything slowed down. I wasn't able or wanting to even speak fast. I spoke very slowly and calmly. There was like all the time in the world. And, I was just able to like move through it, with ease. And so essentially then, I realized at that moment, as I'm reading this book, that when they talked about the terror, I was reminded of that. How I actually have, these characteristics of this trauma response, the sankara, this trauma in my system that came from that experience when I was a child. And what struck me then is, my husband mentioned to me, a few days back when I was like in one of these states where I was feeling the downloads and I was like experiencing an expansion. He said, "You seem manic," is what he said to me. And it immediately had a negative connotation, like bipolar. And, I think I was triggered when I heard it. And then again today, I was talking to a friend of mine, and she said that, as I was speaking and telling her everything that's happening and I was getting all excited, she said, she asked me if I'd ever been bipolar. She said, before I came on the call, I was getting this message that, the word bipolar came into my mind. And immediately my heart sunk. It's like, wow, I'm like telling her about all this amazing stuff. And like this word has all this stigma around it. So then I was like pondering. And then what she said was like thing I'd realized from my last experience with a friend of mine whose daughter has hearing voices and severe mental illness. And I realized that, she sees her trauma has gotten so large. She sees beings that are trying to hurt her. And, she hears voices. and she seemed like they think she might, maybe it's schizophrenia. We're not sure. Don't want to label it, but she's not able to function, and she's has, there've been a lot of problems, and a lot of addictions and so on. And when I was with her, I realized she had this really deep intelligence beneath all that trauma. She was able to read what I was going to say and say it before I said it, tune in to really, research that I was sharing, and she was able to tune in to what I was actually even feeling and reflecting that back when I was excited and I felt like I was on the verge of a discovery. So what I realized was she was highly sensitive. She was deeply intuitive and very intelligent. And one of my predictions that came to me after I left was, I think the shamans of the new world will come from people that have severe mental illness, because they're gifts that have been pathologized, and we don't know how to process them in this culture, like indigenous cultures do this. And so we pathologize and we put them on meds, or we've mistreated, made them feel like they're crazy, and so they suppress the gifts, or they hide the gifts, or they don't know how to handle the gifts. They get scared because of what they're being shown and what they're being told. So my prediction is that the shamans of the new world, and so my friend I was speaking to today was saying, actually, like, I wonder if, like, you would be, like, you have these gifts that are emerging, these superpowers that you're saying, like healing powers and intuitive powers and, predictive powers and like deep intelligence and so on. If that's what part, and then I realized, thinking about it afterwards, because it triggered me when she said it, but then I realized, like, the thing she was saying was, like, you're actually showing us that, what's mental illness maybe is just pathologized, a gift. And then it dawned on me. Our systems are always trying to heal. And so my system, the reason it also took me to this friend of mine whose daughter has severe mental illness, is that in her second chakra, which is what my higher self's been healing quite a bit, and in the last ayahuasca journey, my higher self took me to my second chakra to heal ancestral trauma that comes from desire, identity, sexual identity, in that. And I know my ancestry has a lot of sexual trauma that I was shown in an ancestral healing program. And so then what I realized when I met this woman, who is her daughter, it was a reflection. She's a reflection of me, a much deeper wound within me. My system is trying to show me that, replay the experience, so that I can see it, see the pattern, and then hopefully then heal the trauma within. So when I heal myself, she also would heal, and vice versa. And then I realized that the reason I'm so drawn to trauma research and therapy, the reason I'm so drawn to developmental trauma and to this organization that works with severe mental health, is because it's a deeper healing of mine. It's a reflection of my deepest ancestral collective wound, because they're all ultimately connected. So essentially it's me, my system, my higher self, trying to heal me. And so maybe I'm meant to be like an example. Bipolar, for example, like, let's say that has a real negative label to it, but maybe we pathologize what's a natural phenomena, contraction and expansion. And when I'm able to process that, I tap into gifts, superpowers, or like insights and capabilities, things that might help humanity, shamanic like gifts even that might emerge. And so maybe it's meant to be part of my journey, is to realize and share the fact that I'm a workaholic, so I have an addiction to that. I have characteristics of bipolar, and yet I'm high functioning, right? Like, I went to Harvard, MIT, got a director at Google, and now discovering all of these incredible insights and discoveries. And maybe it's meant to show and bridge. It's not them that I'm trying to find ways to heal. It's me. It's us. It's all us. Anyway, this is my insight. And the last thing I'm going to leave you with is the thing I realized that I didn't mention in my last video around quantum superposition, is that when you're with a therapist or a healer or someone that who can co-regulate with you because they're grounded, and you can then lean, assuming they have the resource, they're either already healed, or when they feel you get stressed and they get triggered, they're able to use their own resource and skills that they've learned in order to ground it. You can then co-regulate with them and ground. And because of that, a therapist is actually able to take you to a lower dimension where you have more severe trauma, but prevents you from getting stuck there, because they can pull you back and bring your awareness back to the place that they're at, so that you can actually heal trauma. And that's why therapists and healers are so powerful. And I discovered that with my higher self in the last ayahuasca journey. She took me, once she was able to fully embody into my system, so I could feel these superpowers, she then took me to these lower dimensions with the deepest trauma, my ancestral trauma in the second chakra. And I literally felt like I was teetering on the edge of insanity, how I described it, because the depression and the psychosis was so great that I was experiencing. Like, I could get stuck there in that dimension, which is what a psychotic breakdown is. Well, my higher self pulled me back, raised my awareness by tapping my chest, and my awareness then came back, and I remembered to ground the energy and heal the trauma. So essentially, if you think about it, we're all reflections of each other. When you go to a therapist or someone who makes you feel calm and you can co-regulate with, it's essentially like they'll keep you tethered. You can stay with them and you can both go to this trauma and heal it, start to heal the trauma, close those timelines in these lower dimensions. So we're just walking each other home. And that's why the peer-to-peer is so powerful. We're here for each other, reflections for each other. And that's what I think we're meant to do across humanity.